when you're looking, when you're looking at how they talk about, again, internally talk about ethnic issues, as mentioned, alluded, blaming outsiders for creating unrest. When they do talk about the unrest, they blame outsiders, blame bad apples or instigators. The Dalai Lama, Rabia Kadir, being targeted as terrorists, and splitists trying to split the Chinese nation. The way that the state talks about these people, the kind of demonizing, divisive language that it uses to talk about them, is very offensive to their ethnic communities and creates further resentment. Whereas with the Han Chinese communities that are receiving this propaganda, when you talk about the incidents of violence across China and 300 protests a day in China, if you look at that and look at what's happening in Tibet and Xinjiang are probably the safest places in China today. But you would never know that based on if you read a Chinese newspaper or talked to Chinese people about their perceptions of how dangerous Xinjiang and Tibet are to them. And but the levels of incidents of violence in these two areas are actually quite low compared to incidents of violence in other parts of China. You also have these images. So these images of in the Han Chinese mind of Tibetans and Uyghurs as very violent and attacking Han Chinese. They're fed by state media, which in recent events has focused nearly exclusively in its media coverage on the violence against Han Chinese. There is, of course, no discussion in the state media about the underlying causes of Uyghur or Tibetan resentment against the Chinese state. These topics are not brought out. Okay, we need to wrap up. And so again, you see this divergence on the narrative, also with the narrative in the West of media coverage about these events. These are difficult issues to deal with in any context, but the authoritarianism of the Chinese state makes them even more complicated because of the lack of space for critical thinking. So as this, going forward, looking at the future, the trend lines are not good. The Chinese government is doubling down on these bad policies and the poor implementation of them. And the likely result will be a situation that becomes harder to manage rather than easier. You see these communities becoming a permanent underclass, disadvantaged underclass in China that is more and more resentful. You see increased Han resentment about the state-provided benefits to these communities, which are becoming a budgetary burden on provincial governments, and people are starting to complain about this. And you'll see increased violence, I think, looking forward if the policies remain unchanged. There are a few bright spots. I want to try to end on bright spots here because it's such a depressing picture when you look at it. There are initiatives such as the Open Constitution Initiative, which has written a report. This is a Han NGO of lawyers and academics. It's written a report calling for changes in policies in Tibet after the events last year. And you have a petition that they circulated online that before it was shut down by the government attracted about 350 signatures, mostly Chinese people, calling for changes in the government's policy. So you have people looking at the environment in Tibet, Chinese looking at the environment in Tibet as a flashpoint, and looking and Chinese who are looking for spirituality and some connection with something deeper than their current situation allows them, gravitating towards Tibetan Buddhism. These micro trends, if you will, have some promise to make the situation better. Also increased freedom of expression, which will create space for critical thinking and a broader discussion about these issues, a more honest discussion about them, are trends that, if they continue to expand, could change the dynamic of this overall very bleak situation. But it would require some substantial changes at the macro level in terms of the government structure to allow them to grow and develop in a way that will affect the underlying attitudes that most Chinese have towards the situation today.
Thank you very much. Ole.
Thank you. Well, thanks Liz and Randy for inviting us down to such a great event. I'll try and be brief because we're going to